Okay, hi everyone. We are doing the very last lecture for this very short course. So today the lecture is on later Homo. So if you have been watching them in order for this, the fourth section, we did, hominins, like a general hominins and bipedalism. Then we talked about the early hominin genera. Then we talked about the Australopithecus and Paranthropus. And then we talked about early Homo on the previous one or before this one, and now we're talking about later Homo. So quite a few in this section. So let's just move right along in this PowerPoint. You'll see the first slide is once again one of those timelines that I've created showing you kind of where we're at as we're going through all of the different, whatever species or genus in the human lineage, right? So you can see on that image, it's got the early genera, which we very briefly talked about, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, Ardipithecus, and then the middle section with Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and we talked about 3 species for each of those genera. And a little more detail on that, and then we are now we're in that kind of third section of the lineage. So the genus Homo, our genus, right? And so in the previous video we already discussed habilis and erectus, and we talked about those kind of debates or questions about whether Homo habilis should be considered to be part of the genus Homo and some of the reasons why, right? We talked about the Homo erectus and the very specific skeletal traits that Homo erectus has, and then we're going to continue this conversation about the rest of Homo. Now the book really throughout the whole lineage gives you more species, it gives you a lot, right? But in the class I tell you which ones we're focusing on, so the same for the genus Homo. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see just kind of a similar timeline, but just with the species. I just want you to see here that when looking at the Paranthropus, branching event, the other part of the lineage, more in our direct ancestry, is still, evolving. And so you can see that Homo habilis is existing around the same time and in the same part of the world as some of those Paranthropus species. And so there is evidence of them interacting in some ways. A lot of that stuff we're still learning about and discovering, but I mean, even before, like obviously with dating and locations and stuff, it seemed like we weren't surprised, that happened. So just keep that in mind. The next slide, so jumping right into Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis is the species that I focus the majority of my research. Well, I'll say like the origin of my ideas, but I definitely branch out talking about Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, hominins in general, apes in general, right? And so you can see here the Smithsonian recreation, once again, a really great one. And now that we're looking at the species, and you can see here on the first bullet point, we're not looking at millions of years ago. We're looking at just hundreds of thousands of years ago. So much more recent in time. And so when I say to you, look at that image and you'll see like something in our ancestry, like that Smithsonian recreation of it is like, you'd be like, oh yeah, that looks different for me, but like kind of the same, right? So it's kind of cool to see this, how these different, traits evolved and stuff. And so you can see here with some of these bullet points that with erectus and then, after that heidelbergensis, obviously there's going to be some similarities. And so we see some general similarities, and I have them listed right there, like the large brow ridge. But you will notice that the brow ridge shape is typically quite different, really between all of the species, but definitely going from like erectus to heidelbergensis, even to like Neanderthal, you can see a difference in how the brow ridge, like its like thickness or its width, the shape of it, all of that. So note those differences. And we're still, even though we're looking at a bigger brain, which you can see here, 1200 cc, so almost within the range, or let's say not too far from the Homo sapien range, right? And but we still have that long, low, like football-shaped cranium. So brains are getting bigger. but they're just kind of getting big and more like elongated in the back, right? You can see here we do have a forehead. Like Heidelbergensis has a forehead. Even like habilis and erectus had a little bit of a forehead. Now remember, there's no goal towards having a forehead. There's no goal towards any trait evolutionarily. But when we see that, we're like, oh, interesting that happened. And then with Homo sapiens, we have like the most pronounced forehead out of all of those in the genus Homo. You can also see here we've got smaller teeth, so that general trend of brains getting bigger, faces kind of getting smaller. And remember also that with Homo erectus, we're now eating meat, although it's, we're still, remember, this is very important, and I talked about this on a previous lecture, that we still have to have a huge portion of our diet has to be plants for the glucose to power our big brains. If you haven't watched that lecture, go back. It's like the last thing I talk about on the previous lecture. It's a very, like, if you take 3 or 4 things away from this class, that's definitely one of them. The connection between our like big brains and dietary changes. It's not what most people understand it to be. So I go into that a little bit. So keep that idea in mind. But at this point, we're definitely, whether it's animal, plant, whatever, we're definitely cooking our food. There's evidence of this happening, right? So now we're doing even less processing. So think about before, you're chewing, even if you're chewing something, not that hard to chew. Now we're doing all like less the chewing and the salivating because we're doing a lot of that processing that most animals do like in their mouth. We're doing it while we're cooking. So food is a lot easier to eat. So now we're seeing that decrease in the size of the teeth like in general. So teeth, faces are getting smaller because of that. Brains continue to get bigger. And then this skull right here that's on this PowerPoint slide is a famous one called Cobway, and that's the one, you might have seen it in class. It's upside down, but oh Lord, that's the one I have. I'm trying to get this like angled right because it's all backwards when I'm trying to do it. Oh Lord, Alicia, that's a little better. No, that's still bad. Hold on, I'll get it. That's a little better. That's Cobway. And you can see here those brow ridges are really prominent. Like the whole upper face really is prominent, right? There's also a feature that we see with Heidelbergensis that we will then see even more prominent in Neanderthal, and it's called mid-face, like the middle part of the face, mid-face prognathism. Now recall, we talked about prognathism before when we talked about like primates versus non-primates, when we talked about hominins compared to like, other primates. And so the prognathism, like the general prognathism of like projection of the snout, right? The mouth and like the mouth, the nose a little bit. But now we're looking at just this area, just in the mid-face. So essentially the maxilla. The maxilla in Heidelbergensis and definitely in Neanderthal, like if you look at our like maxilla right here, like this one right here, right? It's flat this way, right? It's flat, it's like this way, right? In those other 2 species, instead of being flat, it goes like this and it angles. It's a totally different plane that it sets on. This is one of the things I focus on for my research, and so it's very interesting. We see that, like I said, in Heidelbergensis, and we see it even more prominent in Neanderthals. Now, in the lab, you will be able to see the skulls, and it'll be really obvious, like that angle of the middle part of the face. It's very different. Okay, moving on to the next slide. You will see, like I said, I'm never going to ask you the names of the sites or the dates, but these are here for your reference, just so you know where we're talking about different parts of the world, because now we're outside of Africa, right? Well, we're in Africa and outside, versus before Erectus, it was just solely in Africa. Now we're kind of everywhere, in Africa, out of Africa, So here we have just more specimens for you to see. Here we have a few from the side view. You can see that kind of football-shaped cranium. You can see the profile of a fairly flat face, right? But still kind of a pronounced brow ridge. Multiple locations, like I said, around the world. Well, not around the world. We're not in the Americas yet, but, spreading out past Africa. Next slide, Neanderthals. So it is pronounced Neanderthal. It's not Neanderthal. It has never been Neanderthal. That is the incorrect way to say it. Sometimes you will see it spelled with a T. Sometimes you will see it spelled with a TH. It doesn't matter. It's Neanderthal. I will absolutely correct you in class if you say it incorrectly. I guess because maybe someone said it one time and didn't know how to say it and everyone just copied them, but it's not the correct way to say it. I will definitely point it out to you. Not to be rude. I will definitely, you know how it is in class. I try to make it fun, but it's definitely one you want to get this one correct. So you'll see here the Smithsonian recreation of this one. So now looking even more similar to us, right? And no surprise, and we've talked about, well, I think we talked about this in class or on one of the lectures, that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred with each other. In fact, you can do your ancestry stuff. I did mine through 23andMe. I'm not sure if the other ones do it, but you can find out, if you have any, you can find out how much Neanderthal DNA you have. I think, if you have it, usually it's 1% or something like that, right? It's usually not a lot at all. I think the max you can have, which no one does really, but I think the max you can have is 3%. I could be wrong on that. It might be something around it, but it's low, right? So you can see here with the dates, we're not looking at millions of years ago. We're not even looking at hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, I mean a little bit, but the most recent Neanderthal, now we're only looking at tens of thousands of years ago. So humans and Neanderthals were living alongside each other for tens of thousands of years. So it wasn't we're going to get into some of the stories in just a minute, but these stories you hear we interacted and we killed each other. So that's not how it happened at all. You can see here with that skull, some really prominent features to the Neanderthal skull. One, Neanderthals have the largest brain of any of the hominins, bigger than a Homo sapien. They have the largest brain than any of the other hominins. Now, recall, we talked about the difference between absolute brain size and EQ. And so humans, our EQ is a little bit higher. So we're talking about size or EQ or whatever, cognition, we could say it's comparable to humans and Neanderthals, for sure. A lot of the things about us are very comparable in that. But we are different species because our morphology we're quite different. So you can see here sites in modern day, the Middle East or Europe, right? Lots of different sites for Neanderthals. Also look at that skull again, that giant nasal opening. Neanderthals have a very large nasal opening. And I think I have a list coming up maybe on the next slide that goes through some of these. We'll talk about them more. Neanderthal was the very first hominin discovered. So remember, there was a time when there were no fossils. We had zero fossils, a lot of preconceived notions about what we would find, but no fossils. And then one day the very first one was discovered, and it was a Neanderthal skull. And then we get more, later after that. So the very first one was a Neanderthal. Remember, we talked about for the Australopithecines, the Tong specimen Africanus, that was the first Australopithecine discovered. But this is, Neanderthal was the very first out of all of them, the very first hominin discovered. And let's see, okay, next slide. Perfect segue to the Neanderthal morphology. So once again, we have that long, low cranium, but also a fairly large brain. I could probably even change that. 1500 cc's is fine for average. Push it a little bit more, but that's probably fine. So then the next two bullet points are very, very important, and it says adapted for glacial environment or climates ? Or were they? Because this was this very classic idea that Neanderthals have all these really, really unique traits to their face, their head, their body, and they live in a very specific ice age, glacial environment. So it would make sense that all or most of these really specific traits must be because they live in this very specific environment, in terms of natural selection, right? But when scientists actually start looking at, doing the research, and they're realizing actually this doesn't fit, a couple of them do maybe, right? But a lot of these really unique features we see in Neanderthals in the body or the face or the head aren't really working in terms of it being an adaptation to a really cold or glacial environment. So if you go through a few of these, you'll see there's a list of now 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe 8. As an example, the large nasal opening that I pointed out before, they all have a very large nasal opening. Now the classic idea was that they have this large nasal opening because they need to be able to warm the air, because it's very cold. They need to be able to warm the air to breathe it in or something, right? And if you didn't know anything about how breathing works, You might think that's true. You're like, okay, I guess I don't really know. That sounds like it could be right. But then now we realize with a lot of the research is that mammals in cold environments tend to actually have really small nasal openings. So it's like, okay, that one doesn't quite fit. Okay, what about some of the other ones? Also, remember they've got that mid-face prognathism where that maxilla is angling like this. And it used to be thought, trust me, in the past, there are a lot of hypotheses about why we see that feature. And of course, the go-to always is natural selection. But remember, there are 4 other forces to evolution, right? We've got natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, non-random mating, mutation. And so it easily could be one of those other forces. And that's really where the research is pointing to now, is that some of these traits that we see in Neanderthals are probably genetic drift and not natural selection. So, but going back to the mid-face prognathism, one of the hypotheses was that, maybe their sinus, the maxillary sinus, like you have sinuses here and here, right? Basically a hollowed out area of the bone. They thought, well, maybe their sinuses are bigger and it's causing the shift in the way the maxilla looks. But then, we look at the actual sinuses and we realize, well, Neanderthal sinuses aren't actually bigger than the rest of Homo, right? They're not like statistically significantly bigger. And on top of that, animals in cold environments tend to have smaller sinuses. So like, once again, it doesn't really fit with this idea that it's an adaptation to this cold glacial environment. And let's see, what's another one? That's fine for that. I'll go over these other ones. But like, the point I want to make is that a lot of these traits, that classic idea of them being for this very specific environment, might not be fully what's going on. Some of these traits are probably due to natural selection. Some of these traits are probably due to genetic drift, right? And so going through a few of these other ones, like another one that's interesting is shorter distal limbs. Remember those terms? We had to learn proximal versus distal. So on the limb, here we have the arm, right? Remember, on the arm we use proximal distal. If it's closer to the main trunk of your body, it's proximal, and if it's further away, it's distal. So I would say like my hand is distal to my elbow, or my elbow is proximal to my hand, right? So when we're talking about the sections, we would say this is the proximal part, and this is the distal part, right? We have kind of two sections, the arm, the forearm, or like the thigh and the leg, right? Well, and there's usually a ratio, like when we look at, animals in general, there tends to be, whether you're bipedal or quadrupedal, there's like, different rules, but there tends to be a very specific ratio when you see like a proximal limb, or the proximal part of the limb is so many centimeters, then typically you're like, you can kind of guesstimate what the distal part of the limb will be in length. Well, Neanderthals, though, their distal part on the arms and the legs is much shorter, given how we understand these ratios. And so it's really interesting. It's not just like the whole limb is shorter, but just the distal part of the limb, right? So that's interesting. And so there have been some hypotheses about this, maybe it being like natural selection, and they're living in this very mountainous, rocky, craggy like terrain, and maybe this called for kind of a different lever system, like physics-wise, of how like the musculoskeletal system works for like bipedalism in that way. Interesting, and very interesting research in that. So that could be an explanation. That's natural selection, right? Let's see some of the other features. Some of the other features. This one that's in the image, it's called the retromolar space. So retromolar, so like behind the molar. You can see here in the image that there's that third molar, and there's a big space between that last tooth and where the ascending ramus of the mandible kind of begins. If you were to compare that to like a Homo sapien, you would see it's like molar, and then maybe like a centimeter or something, or two, and then you have not even a centimeter, maybe a centimeter. Then you have the ramus. But then in the Neanderthal, it's like 3, 4, 5 centimeters. Variation-wise, there's going to be some variation. But a massive, massive gap. And we still aren't really sure why this is related to some kind of cultural practice with they're doing with the teeth, because they also have extreme dental wear in their front teeth. So we're pretty sure they're using their teeth to like maybe work with like animal hides or something. So is that causing the teeth to move forward? This is why it's really important to have juveniles. Like I talked about this before. When you have a juvenile and an adult, you can see, okay, these traits that happen in adulthood, like either on purpose or just biologically, like they happen at puberty or after puberty, or are these something you're born with, you know? So that's when having a juvenile can be really important. So a lot of really unique features to Neanderthals. Seeing a Neanderthal skull or even the mandible, even as intro students, you should be able to know right away. They look very distinct from the rest. I mean, they all do, but you know what I mean. These ones are, I think, are more obvious than the other ones. So the next line, just another timeline, just kind of filling it in, you will see that humans, so Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, we did not evolve from Neanderthals, but we share a common ancestor. Our common ancestor is Homo heidelbergensis. Now this is when do I need the whiteboard? I have to move the whole thing, my whole setup. I'll just talk about it. You guys can get a mental picture. If I'm talking about it and I think I want to draw it, I'll just get up and draw. So this is when it can get a little confusing to understand who, what, when, where, how all of these species are kind of going and coming and being, you know, evolving and, you know. So think of it this way. We're in Africa, we've got Homo erectus, right? Then Homo erectus leaves Africa. Some populations stay in Africa, some populations go into like parts of Europe, a lot of erectus move into like parts of Asia, really far into Asia, right? So they're really spread out. Well, because there's not enough, you know, connection between these groups, there's not really interbreeding going on in enough of a way to keep all of the Homo erectus evolving in the same trajectory. So what we see is the Homo erectus that are in Asia kind of evolve to a certain way, which we'll talk about later. And then the Homo erectus kind of, you know, in Africa or in Europe or whatever, kind of evolve along a different trajectory. So we're going to talk about another species coming up called Homo floresiensis, and that's what kind of happened to the erectus living in Asia. But coming back to what we're talking about right now with heidelbergensis and Neanderthals and like Homo sapiens, basically what's going on is we've got Homo erectus evolving into Homo heidelbergensis. Well, heidelbergensis as well is kind of in parts of like Africa, like northern parts of Africa, parts of like Europe, a little bit kind of in that general area. And I'm saying it like you're seeing, I'm seeing a mental map in front of me. I'm like, here. So they're kind of in that general area. And then we, you know, obviously get two different, you know, evolutionary trajectories based on those two different, you know, regions. And so the heidelbergensis in like parts of Europe evolves into Neanderthal, right? And then the heidelbergensis more in like parts of Africa evolve into Homo sapiens. Like Homo sapiens as a species, we began in Africa. And then of course later we leave Africa and encounter the Neanderthals in Europe, right? So that's how that story goes. So we could still have Homo erectus populations over in Asia, while in, you know, Europe or Africa, erectus has already evolved into something else. So keep that in mind, right? Okay. Next slide, modern humans, so Homo sapiens. So we use this phrase sometimes called anatomically modern humans, because when we say like behaviorally modern humans, this usually is like a kind of a culture shift. This would be something in like the 102 or 101 you get into a little more. So I have a date here. I could probably push that date back a little bit. So we've been around for a couple 100,000 years. Big brains on average, 1350 to 1400. And now we are the first to have what we call a globular or globe-like or round skull, like on the profile. And like there's no goal towards having a very round head, right? But for whatever reason we do, so this is a derived feature. Remember, all of the others had that, even when they had big brains, it was that kind of football shaped, long, low, a little bit of a forehead, right? But not a lot. But now we have most of our head is up on top rather than behind. And like I mentioned before, a lot of this has to do most likely with the brain lobes. Let's say in Homo neanderthalensis or Neanderthals, if their occipital lobe, or the lobe in the back of the brain, is more developed, you're obviously going to see big brains kind of this way. In the Homo sapiens, if our parietal lobes, or the lobes right here of our brain, are more developed, we might see more of a, a brain, a skull increase this way. So that's very likely what happened. There's some other things too, probably like the muscle structures and how that might have shifted and allowed for certain, this and that. But you can also see this new term, orthognathic. So remember we talked about prognathic or prognathism. Prognathism is when there's projection. When you basically have no projection left. What the hell? You see that weird hair? It's just like doing its own thing. Whatever. Orthognathic basically means there's zero prognathism. No prognathism, basically of a very flat facial profile. So we would say we are orthognathic. Also, we are the first to have a chin. You might be thinking, what do you mean a chin? We all have a mandible, right? But Homo sapiens, let me see if I have a picture of it coming up. Of course I don't. Why would I? So we all have a chin. We all have a mandible, but in Homo sapiens, we're the first to where this part of our mandible, recall this, the mental eminence, actually protrudes anteriorly a little bit. Most of the other ones, we see with even though on their mandible, like Neanderthal, Erectus, whatever, their mandible kind of just slopes back, like kind of into their chin a little bit. And so, once again, everyone's like, what could this mean? It must be natural selection. This, I think the general consensus, because there doesn't seem to be any function to that, is that it's probably sexual selection. Probably females chose it. It looks better. There's probably some underlying indicator of something else. We know how sexual selection works, right? But yeah, so Homo sapiens have that. And just for clarity, we don't have any of those cresting things like we saw before with the Paranthropus genus. We don't even have any of those giant toruses, like a nuchal torus we saw with Erectus or Neanderthals. We have a very gracile skull in general as a species. Now, male to female in our species, massive differences, right? But our species compared to others, we tend to have a lot more gracility. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Some more sites. You can see some of these early Homo sapiens. You're like, okay, that looks like us, but it looks a little different. There's going to be a little bit of, a shift and change in the last couple 100,000 years. But you can see, that flatter forehead, more of the head and brain up here, flatter facial profile, pretty big brain. And then if you go to the next slide, in fact, the next 4 slides talk about modern human origins. Now, in the lecture, when I teach the lecture, I go into this with my students. I don't know if you took someone else, if they went into it. But I'm not gonna, this is more of a conceptual thing, so this is definitely more for the lecture, but I added in here because I like this visual that I have. So here, the first slide says modern human origins, and it tells you there are 2 types, multi-regional versus out of Africa. And I'll tell you right now, this debate isn't really a debate anymore. Maybe 20 years ago it was, but now basically we understand the out of Africa model is the correct model. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the multi-regional model. I have a paragraph, and then the out of Africa model, there's a paragraph. That is for you to read at your leisure another time. It's just kind of a nice condensed version of it. And then the next slide is a visual of the 2 models. And this is the visual that I like to show the students because it kind of gives you a nice kind of visual of what was happening. But really it comes down to 2 main ideas of do you think there was enough, like we talked about a minute ago with Homo erectus, there wasn't enough interbreeding going on to make erectus remain the same species. Multi-regionalists would say there is, but there's not. And now, like I said, in the last 20 years, we have all this DNA backing up that the multi-regional model just isn't accurate. And the out of Africa model is basically what I described to you a minute ago, that Homo sapiens evolved specifically in Africa, and we left Africa, like Erectus left Africa, and then later Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa and then left Africa. There's a lot more to it than that. But like I said, in the lecture, hopefully you were able to go into that. The next slide goes into some of the tools. Let me just skip. We'll skip the tools. We got Levallois and Mousterian. Just go ahead and skip that. Well, if you remember some of these names, recall we talked about with habilis, the tool type for them was Oldowan, and then Erectus, it was a Schulian. If you remember, Mousterian is one for Neanderthals. like that could be a question on the exam. I'm going to have some of the tool types out. So I don't want to sit here and describe it to you, but you'll be able to see them in the lab. The next slide talks about the Upper Paleolithic, and I think, yeah, there's just a couple things there about what we see with Homo sapiens kind of a little bit more recently with some of the art, the types of tools that are being made, right? And I'm going to have some examples of those in class. But I'm moving on to the next slide. It says the controversy of Homo floresiensis. So, back when I took this class many years ago, this was a recent find. Everyone was all excited about it. I mean, I was just an intro student. I had no idea what was going on. But our teacher talked about it. And so then later on, I was like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. Actually, one of the students in this class was asking me about this the other day. And I was like, oh, it's going to be on the next lecture. So, we'll talk about it a little bit. So back in, I don't have the date. I want to say it was like 2006, something like that. It's like 20 years ago. There was this find, and it was a skull on the island of Flores. And it was very interesting because, as you can see, the side-by-side of Floresiensis and a Homo sapien, it looks like a Homo sapien, right? But it's just smaller. And not smaller in like it's an Australopithecine, right? It's definitely not. You can see it's very Homo in its structure of its face, like in terms of our genus, it clearly belongs in our genus. It's just kind of shrunken down, right? And so right away, as we do in science, you only have one specimen or maybe two specimens. You can't really extrapolate that to say anything super meaningful, or at least you can have an educated guess, but you always want to have more to back that up. And so what we see is, unfortunately, with this site, we only have a handful of specimens. There's a lot going on, like bureaucratically in the background with this site about people, like universities or whatever getting access to be able to dig more. And this has been going on for like over a decade, trying to get, government, local government, larger government, different countries, permits, funding, like it's just a lot that's going on. This happens at every site. Typically it doesn't last this long, but it can happen. So unfortunately, there might be a lot more in this area. We just haven't really had the opportunity to really get at it. So, I mean, time will tell if we find more. But anyway, at the time though, when this very first specimen was discovered, everyone was like, ooh, what's this? Is it this? Is it that? And a couple of ideas. One, they were nicknamed the Hobbits because this was like right after like the Lord of the Rings movies were out. And so everyone's like, oh, they're like tiny, right? And so they had this nickname. But a lot of questions about what they were looking at. Was this just a Homo sapien who had some kind of microcephaly? So microcephaly is an underdeveloped brain. And there are many different causes for microcephaly. It could be, like different types of diseases, mutations. You could have a form of microcephaly that just doesn't allow you to develop fetally and there's a miscarriage. You could have a form of microcephaly where you're born and you're moderately functional to maybe not very little in terms of function. And like I said, so variations of how that can present and also a lot of different reasons why it can happen. But essentially, it's a smaller brain, an underdeveloped brain, and so the skull then will, of course, then look small because of that. And so at first, people were like, well, it looks kind of Homo sapien-y, but it's really small, so are we just seeing a Homo sapien from, 20,000 years ago that just had some form of microcephaly, or is it something else? Oh, God. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so some thought maybe that's what it was, but others thought, well, maybe we're seeing something different. And if you go to the next slide, you will see there is a concept called island dwarfing. Island dwarf, and we see this with other animals. On islands, typically larger mammals will get smaller, and then in response, like reptiles or like insects will get bigger, right? This is a documented phenomenon we see on islands. And so we thought, well, we see this with other mammals. maybe this is what happened. Maybe some of those populations of Homo erectus that we know went into far into Asia and apparently into some of the island systems, they got, they're there, they're stuck on the island, and they're just going to continue to evolve in whatever way. Island dwarfing occurs, and so you get basically something that clearly looks like it belongs in our genus, the genus Homo, but it's just a smaller version. Because even when you look at like Homo sapiens, let's say, like modern Homo sapiens, who have some form, like they're like smaller individuals, typically the head is still the same size, right? Like they still have a large brain, they just might be like shorter. And that could present in for a few different reasons, right? So this was interesting in that it wasn't just, the body is shorter, but it's like a Homo sapien face or skull, right? It was like the whole thing was smaller. And so island dwarfing was a perfectly reasonable explanation. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that, and I would recommend this book. I read this book as an undergrad because this particular thing about Floresiensis really interested me. And so I ended up picking up this book. I would highly recommend this book. You'll see on the cover of the book, the author, Dean Falk, she goes into Floresiensis and Tong, which we talked about before. So she talks about both of these specimens and why they're important. And, so it's, if you were interested in this paleo section, this is a good book. I read it as an undergrad. It's, but it's very interesting because in this book, she goes into some of the like CT scans and math and stuff behind these initial investigations into whether Homo floresiensis was island dwarfing or whether it was some form of microcephaly. Now, I'm going to, on the next, I think it's the next slide. Yes, the next slide, you will see an image, right? Now, even with your human eye, you will be able to pick up on this, but just to say the math, the stats back this up. So if you're looking at this image, you'll see in the middle is the Homo floresiensis brain, and we're going to compare a bunch of things to it to see which one it is most similar to. So on above it, it says HS, that's Homo sapien. So it's being compared to just a regular Homo sapien. On the left, you'll see it says MCHS. That's a Homo sapien with microcephaly. So you can see it's definitely different from the Homo sapien one, right? And this is also, just to say, this is also looking at shape. Size is not a factor. So this is a whole other topic about when we look at morphology. Often we kind of shrink things down to the same size to look at just the shape differences, because typically that's more important evolutionarily, as a side note. So you can kind of see here, they're all kind of scaled to be around the same size. So you can just see the shape differences. Below, the one below it is PT, that's Pan troglodytes or chimpanzee, so it's compared to a chimp. And then on the right side, it's HE or Homo erectus. Now, like I said, with your human eye, our flawed human eye, you can still pick up on that one in the middle, Homo floresiensis, looks more similar to HE, right? Homo erectus, and the stats back this up. And so just more evidence in support of this being island dwarfing from Homo erectus, being on these islands and just over time evolving into Homo floresiensis. The next slide, you will see the Smithsonian recreation of Homo floresiensis, that very first specimen. And like I said, there's only been a handful of specimens discovered from this site, like very few. And we have a couple in lab that I'll show you some of the postcrania. But like I said, hopefully in the next few years we get more information from this site and surrounding areas about this species. Okay, now moving on to the last topic, the Piltdown hoax. Okay, so this is a very famous forgery in the field of paleoanthropology. I was laughing because not to get too far into this story with some stuff, but let me see if I can say this in like 30 seconds or less. This other side part. So a few years ago, I had a fellow graduate student, and she was like, "Hey, have you heard of the show called Drunk History? And if you've never heard of Drunk History, you have to watch it. It is an amazing show." And she's like, "I want to do something similar called Drunk Anthropology." And so, like, of course, she came to me with this. And so I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And so instead of using actors, we were going to do like a voiceover, but she was going to do an animation. And so she's like, "Pick a story that you can tell, that you enjoy telling, that if you get drunk might be fun to tell." And I was like, "Sure." So I picked this story, right? So unfortunately, we never finished that little side project, so I don't have any animation to show you, but it was a cool idea. Okay, so, but the story is, as you can see here, starts out, there's this man named Charles Dawson, and he is what we call like an amateur archaeologist. Like in the past, you didn't have to necessarily have a degree. You could just be from like a wealthy family, and you're like, oh, I'm an archaeologist. we don't do it that way anymore, right? So he's doing his thing, and remember these preconceived notions that these scientists, mostly scientists in Europe, thought they're going to find that the human ancestry is in Europe, which they thought it was all going to be in Europe, right? Some of it is, right? We know some of it is Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis, but the majority of it's happening in Africa, right? They also had the preconceived notion, the incorrect preconceived notion, that early in our lineage we would have like more like ape or chimp-like bodies with big heads, and now we know it's the complete opposite, right? We have like bipedalism and modern height, and then our brains get bigger. So these preconceived notions they had were wrong. And so you can see this is in the early 1900s. So a handful of other specimens have already been discovered. We've got a Neanderthal, like a couple things, right? I think Erectus is around the same time, but those first few finds, and Tong and stuff, are being disregarded because of these preconceived notions. And so here comes a specimen. So Charles Dawson is like, oh, I found this specimen. I was digging in this field in England. I think it's something in the human lineage. And everyone's like so excited because they're like, yes, it's in Europe. It has to be, And so the specimen, though, is like a big-brained but very ape-like face. And they have nothing to compare it to. Imagine there's like no fossils or like 2 or something. And this is fitting their preconceived notions. And so they believe it right away, right? And then he calls like his friend Arthur Woodward, who's actually like works, is an actual scientist. And he's like, hey, you need to come to my site and we're going to dig up some more stuff. So then he gets a team of people and they're doing a whole like setting up the site to be dug in sections. They're trying to do it the correct way, sectioning everything up. And then a little later, Charles Dawson, also alone again, finds another specimen. And so this is how the story goes. Now, afterward, when everyone finds out this is a hoax, like decades later, some of the people who were working on that site who were younger at the time are still around. They're reporting, oh yeah, like he always was like kind of like secretive about the specimens. We all just thought he was like eccentric or whatever. No one thought he was actually like making it up, And so there have also been a lot of books and stuff written about this whole thing because, there's a lot of background conspiracy theories about this. Like, was it just, I haven't gotten into the rest of it yet, but was it just Charles Dawson doing this to try to make a name for himself? Was it like a practical joke gone wrong? Was it way more of an elaborate political conspiracy? Because I guess there's some political connections here. And anyway, but so it's an interesting topic to look into. But coming back to the actual forgery, and so basically what happened, and like this would not really happen now. Basically what happened is there are these handful of specimens he's discovered. Like only he and maybe a couple others have looked at them, and then they get put behind glass or whatever at a museum, and no one really examines them, collects data from them. It just sits there. Nowadays that wouldn't happen, right? The whatever individual or lab or museum or whatever that found it, they would get first dibs at measurements and publishing some papers. But then later, right, then other people would be allowed to take measurements or collect data in some way. But it wasn't until decades later, like the 1940s, that researchers were like, well, we have a lot of fossils now that are kind of telling this very particular story of human evolution. And Piltdown doesn't fit with that. And like I said, initially a lot of these fossil finds were like disregarded, so kind of set back paleoanthropology a bit. But eventually there's so many fossils that it's like, well, now Piltdown clearly stands out as something weird's going on. So then these researchers, let me see, go to the next slide. I think I got ahead of myself. Oh yeah, so here you can see in the next slide kind of talking about what was going on with what I already said, I already said that. I'm going to the next slide where it says more Piltdown, and it shows the skull, right? And so it wasn't until, like I said, it was like 1949, 1950, something like that, where these researchers were like, let's go look at the Piltdown specimen. Let's take some photos, let's take some measurements, collect some data. Let's just see why this one is the odd one out now. Like, did we get it wrong? Like, what's going on with Piltdown? And so literally within minutes, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes of getting access to this specimen, this famous, like the first specimen, and looking at it, they realize this is totally faked. And so you can see here on the bullet point on some of the slides, it's essentially, and it's fragmented, so it's not like it was a fully complete skull. When you have some fragments, especially in the right locations, you could say, oh, this kind of doesn't quite fit because it's like a fragment, right? You're not like trying to line everything up perfectly because it's fragmented. And so he used this to his benefit. And so basically it's like a human skull, but it's an orangutan mandible. And they realized this right away. Like there was evidence of the bone being like filed or shaved down. There was evidence of teeth, different teeth from different animals being glued in to the mandible, like with wood glue. The bone itself was stained with like tea and stuff to make it look older. But it was obvious to these researchers literally within minutes of looking at this that this was totally faked. And so they're like, okay, now this whole thing makes sense. But then it calls into question, like I said, all of these different things, these controversies behind what happened. Like these people, whether Charles Dawson faked this, how did the other, even though it was only a few people he let see it, how did these other people not know this was clearly a fake? And what were the reasons why they didn't say anything, right? Was it some national pride? Was it some kind of, underlying racial thing? Was it just them wanting to be famous? Right? We don't know. But yeah, if you were like, this seems like a cool topic, a lot of books, documentaries about this, it's very, very interesting. But unfortunately, it set back paleo a little bit, but as science is a self-correcting system, we checked on this. Probably took us a little longer than it should have, checks and balances, but we have refined that more so now. I would be so surprised if something like this happened now and it took so long for us to figure out. In fact, there have been a handful of stories. I remember when I first started my PhD program, maybe like in the second or third year, there were a couple stories that came out where people had faked their data for like their masters and PhDs. Like there was these couple of famous stories. Like there are shitty, cheating people in every field, right? Science, not science, and everywhere, right? But in science, we tend to hold ourselves to a higher like standard, And apparently, yeah, this one, I forget, I'd have to pull up the article. It was a very famous story though. This one young man, I think his field was like political science or something, and he had faked his data, which is really weird because like I'm doing this now. Like, I mean, I've already collected my data, but there's a lot of oversight by your instructor or your advisor. I mean, every advisor is a little different, but just for them to not know anything about this, that they weren't actually collecting their data. I guess if I'm remembering correctly, their data collection was that they were doing surveys on people. So they were supposed to be going around to people in the town or whatever and collecting, doing questionnaires. And he was like making a giant like Excel spreadsheet or something. But apparently he was just filling it in with whatever he wanted. And so, like I said, if I'm remembering the story correctly, this was definitely like 5 or 6 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, they eventually found it out. He'd already gotten his PhD because, he'd done this, and then he'd already gotten a job somewhere, and basically they fired him and they took away his PhD. And it's like, why did you do that? You know what I mean? Just collect the data, because now you've like screwed up your entire academic career. Like, even if you're like, oh, maybe I'm just going to collect the data now, no one's going to want to hire you to be a scientist anywhere. It just boggles my mind that would happen. But so like that was found out pretty quickly. That's not really something as terms of like a larger scale like Piltdown, but you know what I mean. So anyway, like we're a little better at that now. But okay, so this is the last one, and I'll see you guys in class on Wednesday for the last lab, the last worksheet, the final, all of that.